In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail into the unknown, risking everything on a journey that could end in glory or disaster. Armed with faulty maps, unshakable ambition, and a relentless belief that he could reach Asia by sailing west, he ventured into an ocean no European had ever dared cross. What he found instead would change the world forever. But at what cost? This is the real story of Columbus, his voyages, and the legacy that still sparks debate today. Christopher Columbus was born between August 25th and October 31st, 1451, in the Republic of Genoa, a thriving maritime city-state in what is now Italy. His father, Domenico Colombo, was a wool weaver who also owned a cheese stand, where young Christopher likely helped out. His mother, Susanna Fontanarossa, managed the household and raised Columbus alongside his three brothers, Bartholomew, Giovanni Pellegrino, and Giacomo, Diego, as well as a sister, Bianchinetta. Growing up in a bustling port city, Columbus was exposed to the maritime trade that dominated Genoa's economy. His brother, Bartholomew, later became a cartographer in Lisbon, suggesting that the family had connections to the world of navigation and exploration. Though much of Columbus's early life remains obscure, scholars believe he received some education in reading, writing, and Latin, which would have been useful for a merchant or sailor. Despite his modest background, Columbus developed an early fascination with the sea. By the time he reached his teenage years, he likely worked on merchant ships, gaining valuable experience in navigation and trade. These formative years set the foundation for his later ambitions of exploration and discovery. During the 1470s, Christopher Columbus began his life at sea, marking the start of his career as a sailor and merchant. By this time, he had left Genoa and ventured into the wider Mediterranean and Atlantic trade networks, seeking opportunities in maritime commerce. In 1473, Columbus is believed to have worked as an apprentice for a Genoese merchant family, the Centurione, Di Negro, and Spinola families, who were involved in trade across the Mediterranean. This experience exposed him to seafaring, navigation, and commerce, skills that would be crucial in his later voyages. By 1476, Columbus had made his way to Portugal, a dominant naval power at the time. That year, he sailed aboard a Genoese convoy heading toward England, but the fleet was attacked by French privateers off the coast of Cape St. Vincent. His ship was burned, and Columbus was forced to swim to shore, narrowly escaping death. After this incident, he made his way to Lisbon, where he joined his brother Bartholomew, who was working as a cartographer. Living in Portugal, Columbus became involved in the lucrative Atlantic trade, sailing to destinations such as Madeira, the Azores, and even West Africa. Portuguese explorers were already charting new routes down the African coast in search of gold and spices, and Columbus likely gained valuable experience in long-distance navigation during this time. In 1479, Columbus married Filipa Moniz Perestrelo, the daughter of a respected Portuguese nobleman and explorer, Bartolomeu Perestrelo, who had been one of the early settlers of the island of Porto Santo in the Madeira archipelago. Through this marriage, Columbus gained access to important Portuguese naval and exploration circles, further fueling his interest in discovery. By the end of the 1470s, Columbus had become well-versed in the latest navigational techniques and had first-hand experience in Atlantic voyages. He had also begun formulating his ambitious plan to reach Asia by sailing west, an idea that would shape the course of history in the coming decades. By the early 1480s, Columbus was living in Lisbon, Portugal, with his wife Filipa Moniz Perestrelo, whom he had married around 1479. Through her, he gained access to Portuguese noble circles and information about overseas exploration. The Portuguese were actively expanding their maritime empire, exploring the West African coast and searching for new routes to the Indian Ocean. Columbus participated in several Portuguese expeditions, possibly reaching Elmina, modern-day Ghana, on the Gold Coast of West Africa, where Portugal had established a fort. He also made voyages to the Madeira Islands, the Azores, and the Canary Islands, gaining first-hand experience in navigating the Atlantic and learning about prevailing winds and ocean currents, knowledge that would be critical for his future plans. Around 1484 or 1485, Filipa Moniz likely passed away, leaving Columbus a widower with their young son, Diego Columbus. After her death, Columbus left Portugal and moved to Castile, Spain. Some historians suggest that he may have fallen out of favor with the Portuguese court after unsuccessfully seeking funding for his westward voyage from King John II of Portugal. The king and his advisors believed that sailing around Africa was a more reliable way to reach the Indies rather than Columbus's unproven westward route. In Castile, Columbus settled in Palos de la Frontera and later Seville, where he began seeking royal support for his plans. During this time, he formed relationships with influential figures, including Friar Antonio de Marchena and Luis de Santangel, who would later help him secure an audience with the Spanish monarchs. Between 1485 and 1486, Columbus presented his proposal to King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, arguing that sailing westward across the Atlantic would be a shorter and more direct route to the wealth of Asia. However, Spanish experts, like their Portuguese counterparts, remained skeptical of his calculations, believing he had underestimated the size of the Earth. As a result, the monarchs rejected his request, but allowed him to remain in their court. During this period, Columbus took on a mistress, Beatriz Enriquez de Arana, a woman from Córdoba, who later became the mother of his second son, Ferdinand Columbus, born in 1488. For much of the late 1480s, Columbus continued lobbying for his expedition, traveling between Spanish noble courts and seeking patronage. However, his efforts faced repeated setbacks, as Spain was still focused on completing the Reconquista, the final war against the Muslim Kingdom of Granada. By 1489, Spain was on the verge of victory, but Columbus still had no official support. Despite these challenges, Columbus refused to abandon his dream. As the decade came to a close, he remained in Spain, awaiting an opportunity that would finally come in the 1490s, when the completion of the Reconquista would shift Spain's focus toward overseas expansion. Christopher Columbus's desire to reach Asia by sailing west was shaped by a combination of historical trade patterns, geographical misunderstandings, and the political and economic ambitions of European powers in the late 15th century. His plan was based on the pursuit of wealth, knowledge of ancient geography, and the growing maritime expansion of European kingdoms. For centuries, Europe had coveted the riches of Asia, particularly China, Japan, and India. These lands were famed for their spices, silk, gold, and other luxury goods, which were brought to Europe via long and expensive trade routes. The Silk Road, the overland trade network stretching from China to the Mediterranean, was the primary connection between Europe and Asia. However, with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which conquered Constantinople in 1453, this route became increasingly difficult and costly for European merchants. By Columbus's time, Portugal had begun exploring a sea route around Africa to reach Asia. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors had mapped parts of the African coast, and by 1488, Bartolomeu Dias successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that the Indian Ocean could be reached by sailing around Africa. Columbus, however, believed he had a shorter alternative, sailing westward across the Atlantic to reach Asia directly. Columbus's plan was based on several key miscalculations. He underestimated the size of the Earth, relying heavily on the works of the ancient Greek geographer Ptolemy, who had calculated the circumference of the Earth as much smaller than it actually was. He also overestimated the size of Asia, influenced by Marco Polo's accounts, and believed that Asia extended much farther east than it actually did, making the distance across the Atlantic seem much shorter. Furthermore, neither Columbus nor any European of his time knew about the vast landmasses that lay between Europe and Asia. Columbus calculated that the journey westward to Asia would only be about 2,500 to 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, when in reality, the true distance was more than 12,000 miles. If not for the unexpected presence of the Americas, his expedition would have faced disaster due to lack of supplies. Columbus's quest was not purely economic. He was also influenced by religious and ideological factors. As a devout Catholic, he believed his mission was not just about trade, but also about spreading Christianity. He hoped to convert the peoples of Asia, and if possible form alliances with Eastern Christian rulers, such as the mythical Prester John, to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. Additionally, Spain, under Ferdinand and Isabella, sought to compete with Portugal, which was leading maritime exploration. Funding Columbus's plan was a chance to outmaneuver the Portuguese in the race for overseas wealth. Between 1484 and 1492, Columbus sought sponsorship for his voyage. Portugal, England, and France all rejected his plan, largely because their advisors understood the true scale of the earth and doubted his calculations. However, after the successful completion of the Reconquista in January 1492, Spain's monarchs turned their attention to overseas expansion. After much debate, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand agreed to fund Columbus's journey, hoping it would bring them immense wealth and prestige. Thus, Columbus's voyage was not simply a reckless gamble, but rather a product of centuries of trade, exploration, and ambition, all built upon incorrect but widely accepted geographical theories. Christopher Columbus's plan to reach Asia by sailing west was not just based on ambition and theoretical geography, but also required an understanding of nautical considerations. As an experienced sailor, Columbus was familiar with the prevailing winds and currents of the Atlantic Ocean. During his earlier voyages, he had observed the trade winds, which blow consistently from east to west, making a westward journey feasible. He also knew about the Canary Current, a major Atlantic current flowing southwest from the Iberian Peninsula toward the Caribbean. These natural forces would help propel a fleet across the ocean, but the return journey required a different strategy. Columbus had studied the westerlies, winds that move eastward in the northern Atlantic, which he believed could be used to navigate back to Europe. This knowledge, though not fully developed at the time, gave him confidence that an expedition westward could be successful. However, even with a sound understanding of oceanic conditions, Columbus faced an enormous challenge in securing the necessary funding and ships for such a voyage. Since the 1480s, he had been seeking financial support first from Portugal. He presented his idea to King John II of Portugal, arguing that the fastest route to Asia was not by sailing around Africa, but by heading directly west across the Atlantic. Portuguese advisors, however, rejected his plan, believing that he had vastly underestimated the distance to Asia. The Portuguese crown was already committed to the African route, which had shown promising results under explorers like Diogo Cao and Bartolomeu Dias, so they saw little reason to invest in Columbus's uncertain proposition. Undeterred, Columbus left Portugal and travelled to Spain in 1485, seeking the patronage of Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon. Spain, like Portugal, was eager to expand its influence and wealth, but at the time it was still engaged in the final phase of the Reconquista, the war to expel the Muslim kingdom of Granada. Columbus initially failed to convince the Spanish crown, as their advisors, much like the Portuguese, dismissed his calculations as deeply flawed. While he waited for another opportunity, he stayed in Spain, living in the cities of Seville and Córdoba, where he gained the support of influential figures such as Friar Antonio de Marchena and Luis de Santangel, a royal finance officer. Columbus remained persistent, refining his arguments and leveraging his growing network of supporters. By 1491, Spain was on the verge of defeating Granada, and with the kingdom soon to be unified under Christian rule, Isabella and Ferdinand turned their attention to overseas expansion. Columbus again presented his case, and this time, with Spain seeking a way to compete with Portugal's growing influence in maritime exploration, he found a more receptive audience. The Spanish monarchs deliberated for months, and though still skeptical of Columbus's claims, they saw an opportunity for potential wealth and prestige if his journey succeeded. In April 1492, Columbus finally reached an agreement with the Spanish crown in what became known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe. Under this agreement, Columbus was granted the titles of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of any new lands he discovered, giving him noble status and significant authority over future territories. Additionally, he was promised 10% of all wealth acquired from these new lands and the right to invest in future voyages for a share of the profits. This contract, remarkably generous for an unproven explorer, reflected both the potential rewards Spain envisioned and Columbus's unyielding determination to secure his legacy. With royal approval, Columbus immediately began preparations for his historic voyage. He gathered a small fleet consisting of 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and recruited a crew from the port town of Palos de la Frontera, many of whom were experienced sailors and navigators. In August 1492, after years of rejection and uncertainty, Columbus finally set sail across the Atlantic, convinced that he would reach the fabled riches of Asia. What lay ahead, however, would change the course of history in ways neither he nor the Spanish crown had anticipated. On August 3, 1492, after years of struggle to secure funding and approval, Christopher Columbus finally set sail from Palos de la Frontera, Spain, on his long-awaited voyage westward. The fleet was crewed by about 90 men, including experienced sailors, navigators, and adventurers eager for riches and discovery. The first stop on the voyage was the Canary Islands, where the fleet paused for several weeks to make repairs and gather provisions. The Pinta had suffered damage to its rudder, possibly sabotaged by its unwilling owner, who feared the expedition would fail. The crew also took advantage of favorable winds, waiting for the right moment to begin their crossing of the Atlantic. Finally, on September 6, 1492, they departed from the Canaries and sailed west into the vast, uncharted ocean. The journey across the Atlantic was longer than Columbus had anticipated. Although he had assured his crew that Asia was only a few weeks away, the days dragged on without sight of land. To maintain morale, Columbus kept 2 sets of logs, one with the true distance traveled, and another that understated the journey's length to reassure his men. The men grew increasingly anxious, fearing they would run out of supplies or be stranded at sea with no land in sight. Some began to talk of turning back. Columbus, however, remained steadfast, promising them that land would soon appear. As the voyage continued, signs of land began to emerge. Floating vegetation and small pieces of carved wood were spotted in the water, and birds were seen flying westward, suggesting that land was near. Tensions remained high, but Columbus urged his men to press forward. Finally, on the night of October 11, 1492, Rodrigo de Triana, a sailor aboard the Pinta, spotted a distant shoreline under the moonlight. At dawn on October 12th, the fleet arrived at a small island in the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. The exact location remains uncertain, but many historians believe it was present-day Guanahani. Columbus and his crew disembarked, planting the Spanish flag and formally claiming the land for Ferdinand and Isabella. They encountered the island's Taíno people, who were friendly and welcoming. Columbus described them in his journal as generous and hospitable, noting their simple clothing and lack of iron weapons. Believing he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, he called the inhabitants Indians. He was convinced that the riches of China and Japan were just beyond the next horizon. Over the following weeks, Columbus and his men explored the nearby islands, including what is now Cuba and Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. He was disappointed not to find the gold and spices he had promised the Spanish crown, but was fascinated by the lush landscapes and the potential for future Spanish settlement. The Taíno people traded with the newcomers, offering food, cotton, and gold ornaments, which further convinced Columbus that greater riches lay ahead. On December 24, 1492, tragedy struck when the Santa Maria ran aground off the coast of Hispaniola. With no way to repair the ship, Columbus ordered the construction of a small settlement, La Navidad, using materials from the wreckage. He left 39 men behind to establish a Spanish foothold in the New World, assuring them that he would return with reinforcements and supplies. On January 16, 1493, Columbus set sail for Spain aboard the Niña, while the Pinta, which had separated earlier, rejoined him later on the return voyage. The crossing back to Europe was rough, with violent storms nearly sinking the ships. Columbus and his men barely survived, eventually reaching the Azores before sailing home to Spain. When Columbus finally arrived in Palos de la Frontera on March 15, 1493, he was met with a hero's welcome. He traveled to Barcelona to report to Ferdinand and Isabella, presenting them with gold, exotic birds, and several Taino captives as proof of his discovery. The Spanish monarchs, eager to capitalize on this newfound land, granted Columbus further support for future expeditions. Columbus believed he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, unaware that he had instead stumbled upon an entirely new continent. His first voyage marked the beginning of European exploration and colonization of the Americas, forever changing the course of history. After his triumphant return to Spain in March 1493, Christopher Columbus was celebrated as a hero. News of his discovery spread quickly, and the Spanish crown wasted no time in preparing a second expedition. Unlike the first voyage, which had been a risky and uncertain venture, this new mission was a full-scale colonization effort, backed by the authority of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Their goal was not only to claim new lands, but also to establish permanent settlements, convert the indigenous peoples to Christianity, and exploit the resources of the islands Columbus had found. On September 25, 1493, Columbus set sail from Cadiz with a much larger fleet than before. 17 ships carrying around 1,200 to 1,500 men. Among them were soldiers, priests, artisans, and farmers, all recruited to build Spain's first overseas colonies. The fleet also carried livestock, seeds, and supplies necessary for sustaining a permanent European presence in the New World. The expedition had an air of confidence and grandeur, as Columbus and his men believed they were expanding the Spanish Empire into the rich lands of Asia. Following a more southerly route than his first voyage, Columbus reached the Caribbean in just over a month. On November 3, 1493, he sighted an island in the Lesser Antilles, which he named Dominica. From there, the fleet continued through the island chain, naming and claiming various lands, including Guadeloupe, Montserrat, Antigua, and St. Kitts. The indigenous peoples Columbus encountered were different from the Taino he had met on his first voyage. These were the Caribs, a more warlike group who resisted European intrusion. Reports of Carib warriors engaging in cannibalism fueled Spanish fears and justified their belief that conquest and conversion were necessary. Columbus's most urgent concern, however, was returning to La Navidad, the small settlement he had left on Hispaniola after the Santa Maria wrecked during the first voyage. When he arrived in late November 1493, he was met with a grim scene. The settlement had been completely destroyed. The fort was burned down, and the men he had left behind were dead. It was soon discovered that conflict had erupted between the Spaniards and the local Taino people. Some of the settlers had mistreated the natives, taking their women and demanding gold. In retaliation, the Taino, led by Chief Caonabo, attacked and wiped out the settlement. The loss of La Navidad was a crushing blow to Columbus, but rather than abandon his mission, he decided to rebuild on a different part of the island. In early 1494, Columbus founded a new settlement, La Isabela, further east along the northern coast of Hispaniola. This was the first permanent European colony in the Americas, but it quickly suffered from severe hardships. The location was poorly chosen, with little access to fresh water and fertile land. The settlers struggled with disease, hunger, and infighting, as many resented Columbus's leadership. In response to the growing tensions, Columbus imposed strict discipline and harsh punishments on those who disobeyed him. Determined to find the vast riches he had promised the Spanish crown, Columbus led an exploration of the interior of Hispaniola in search of gold. His men discovered small amounts of the precious metal, but nothing close to the great wealth of Asia that Columbus had expected. Frustrated, he launched military campaigns against the indigenous people, demanding tributes of gold and labor. Resistance was met with brutal force, as the Spanish used their superior weapons to subjugate the native population. Many Taino were enslaved or forced to work in gold mines, a practice that would set the precedent for future Spanish conquests. In April 1494, Columbus set sail to explore other parts of the region, reaching the southern coast of Cuba and venturing into Jamaica. He was convinced that Cuba was part of mainland China and refused to accept any evidence to the contrary. Despite urging his men to press forward, they eventually refused, and Columbus was forced to return to Hispaniola. Back in La Isabela, the colony was on the verge of collapse. Many settlers were sick, Supplies were running low, and dissatisfaction with Columbus's leadership was growing. Complaints about his harsh rule and failure to find wealth reached Spain, and in 1495, Ferdinand and Isabella sent Juan Aguado, an investigator, to assess the situation. Sensing trouble, Columbus decided to return to Spain in 1496 to defend himself. Leaving his brother Bartholomew Columbus in charge, he set sail with a handful of captives, including some Taíno prisoners, arriving back in Spain in June 1496. Columbus's second voyage had been far more difficult than his first. While he had successfully established Spain's first colony in the New World, he had failed to find the wealth he had promised. His treatment of the indigenous people and his strict rule over the settlers had also begun to tarnish his reputation. Despite these challenges, Columbus remained convinced that he was on the brink of reaching the great riches of Asia. With his credibility on the line, he would soon embark on yet another voyage, determined to prove himself once more. Christopher Columbus's third voyage was vastly different from his previous two. By 1498, his reputation in Spain had suffered. While his first voyage had been met with great celebration, and his second had resulted in the establishment of Spain's first permanent colony in the New World, it had also brought reports of mismanagement, harsh rule, and the failure to deliver the vast riches he had promised. Many in the Spanish court, including nobles and rival explorers, began to question whether Columbus was truly capable of overseeing Spain's expanding empire. Despite this growing skepticism, Columbus was still granted permission for a third voyage, though under much stricter conditions. He was given 6 ships, far fewer than the 17 he had commanded during his second expedition. The Spanish crown, wary of his governance, instructed him to focus less on exploration and more on stabilizing the colony on Hispaniola, where growing unrest among both the Spanish settlers and the indigenous population threatened to undo Spain's foothold in the New World. Columbus set sail from Sanlúcar de Barrameda on May 30th, 1498. This time, he planned to take a more southerly route than before, hoping to find new lands and, most importantly, a passage to the riches of Asia. He divided his fleet. 3 ships went straight to Hispaniola with much-needed supplies, while Columbus took the remaining 3 on an exploratory course. He sailed toward the Cape Verde Islands, enduring intense heat and stagnant winds that slowed progress and nearly exhausted their drinking water. Desperate, the crew prayed for rain, which finally came just in time to save them. On July 31st, 1498, Columbus and his men sighted land. They had reached an island, which Columbus named Trinidad. Sailing along its coast, they entered the Gulf of Paria, where they became the first Europeans to set eyes on the mainland of South America. Columbus, however, did not immediately realize the significance of this discovery. As he explored the coast of what is now Venezuela, he marveled at the freshwater currents pouring into the ocean from the Orinoco River, so vast that he suspected they must come from an enormous landmass. He theorized that this might be the edge of the earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, rather than a new continent. Still convinced that his voyages had taken him to islands off the coast of Asia, Columbus did not fully grasp that he had stumbled upon an entirely different part of the world. Despite the potential importance of this discovery, Columbus did not stay long. His primary duty was to return to Hispaniola and reassert control over the colony, where reports of rebellion and discontent had reached Spain. Leaving the South American coast behind, he set sail for Hispaniola, arriving on August 19, 1498, only to find the colony in chaos. Since his departure 2 years earlier, tensions had exploded between the Spanish settlers, the indigenous Taíno people, and Columbus's own appointed officials. The settlers were frustrated by Columbus's rigid rule, the lack of gold, and the harsh conditions in the colony. Many resented his favoritism toward his brothers, Bartholomew and Diego Columbus, who governed in his absence. To make matters worse, Columbus's system of forced labor among the native population had led to growing resistance, with Taíno uprisings breaking out across the island. Spanish rebels, led by Francisco Roldan, openly defied Columbus's authority. Roldan and his men seized control of parts of the colony, refusing to recognize Columbus's leadership. Rather than confront the rebels with force, Columbus attempted to negotiate, offering land and privileges to those who would pledge loyalty. This only weakened his control further, as more settlers demanded similar rewards. The situation spiraled out of control, with factions forming, and Columbus, struggling to maintain order, found himself isolated and increasingly unpopular. Back in Spain, rumors of Columbus's mismanagement and the deteriorating conditions in Hispaniola reached King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Concerned about losing control of the colony, they sent Francisco de Bobadilla, a royal administrator, to investigate. When Bobadilla arrived in August 1500, he was shocked by the level of discontent among the Spanish settlers. He quickly took action, assuming full authority over the colony and arresting Columbus and his brothers. In a humiliating turn of events, Columbus was shackled in chains and sent back to Spain as a prisoner. When he arrived in late 1500, the Spanish monarchs were taken aback by his treatment. Although they no longer fully trusted him, they released him from captivity, restored some of his titles, and allowed him to plead his case. However, Columbus was not reinstated as governor of Hispaniola, a clear sign that his influence was waning. The third voyage had been a disaster politically, but it had resulted in the most important geographical discovery of Columbus's career, the sighting of the South American mainland. Yet, blinded by his belief that he had reached the outskirts of Asia, Columbus failed to recognize the true significance of what he had found. His dream of discovering a westward passage to the riches of the East was unraveling, but he was still determined to make one final voyage to prove his vision correct. By the time Christopher Columbus set sail on his fourth and final voyage in 1502, he was no longer the celebrated explorer he had once been. His third voyage had ended in disgrace, arrested, sent back to Spain in chains, and stripped of his governorship of Hispaniola. Though King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella released him and restored some of his titles, he was never again entrusted with the rule of Spanish territories in the New World. His reputation was in decline, and many at court saw him as an aging, stubborn dreamer who had failed to deliver on his promises of untold wealth. Yet Columbus was not ready to accept defeat. He still clung to the belief that he had reached the fringes of Asia and that a passage to the riches of the East could be found. He convinced King Ferdinand to finance one last expedition, arguing that he could still find a western route to India and China. However, this time, the Spanish crown had little faith in him. Columbus was expressly forbidden from stopping at Hispaniola, where tensions still ran high. His mission was solely to explore new lands and find a passage westward, not to govern or meddle in the affairs of the colony. On May 9, 1502, Columbus departed from Cadiz with a fleet of 4 ships, the Capitana, Gallega, Vizcaína, and Santiago de Palos, and around 140 men, including his son Fernando Columbus, who accompanied him as a page. Columbus, now in his early 50s, was suffering from severe arthritis and other ailments, but his determination remained unshaken. The voyage was plagued with difficulties from the outset. As Columbus approached Hispaniola, a powerful hurricane was forming in the Caribbean. Columbus, experienced in reading the signs of the sea, predicted the coming storm and sought shelter in Santo Domingo, hoping to warn the new Spanish governor, Nicolás de Ovando, of the impending danger. Ovando, still distrustful of Columbus, refused to let him dock and dismissed his warnings. As Columbus anchored offshore, the hurricane struck with devastating force. A fleet of 30 ships carrying Spanish officials, supplies, and wealth bound for Spain was caught in the storm and destroyed. Among the casualties was Francisco de Bobadilla, the man who had once arrested Columbus and sent him back to Spain in chains. Ironically, Columbus's own ships, having remained at anchor, survived the storm mostly unscathed. Denied entry to Hispaniola, Columbus pressed on, sailing westward towards Central America. In July 1502, he reached the coast of Honduras, becoming the first European to explore this part of the Americas. Over the next several months, Columbus and his crew navigated the coastline of modern-day Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama, encountering indigenous peoples who spoke of a land rich in gold. This fueled Columbus's hopes that he was close to the fabled riches of the East. In October 1502, Columbus arrived at Almirante Bay in present-day Panama, where he believed he had found the gateway to Asia. He spent months searching for a strait that would lead to the Indian Ocean, convinced that one existed. Instead, he discovered the Isthmus of Panama, a narrow strip of land separating the Atlantic from the Pacific, though he never realized just how close he was to an entirely new ocean. While exploring the region, Columbus attempted to establish a colony, but constant conflicts with indigenous tribes, treacherous weather, and disease made it impossible. In early 1503, a massive storm wrecked 2 of his ships, forcing him to abandon his attempt at settlement. The remaining ships, worm-eaten and falling apart, were barely seaworthy. With no choice, Columbus set sail back toward the Caribbean, desperately searching for refuge. By June 1503, Columbus and his crew were stranded on the north coast of Jamaica. The 2 remaining ships were too damaged to sail, forcing Columbus and his men to take shelter on the island. They built makeshift huts on the shore, but their situation quickly deteriorated. Supplies ran low, and the local Taíno people, who had initially provided them with food, grew tired of the Spaniards' demands and refused to help further. Facing starvation and rebellion among his own men, Columbus devised a desperate plan. He had an almanac with him, which contained astronomical data, including a prediction of a lunar eclipse on February 29, 1504. He met with the local Taíno leaders and warned them that his Christian God was angry at their refusal to provide food, and that soon he would darken the moon as a sign of his wrath. When the eclipse occurred exactly as Columbus had predicted, the Taíno were terrified and begged for forgiveness, agreeing to resume supplying food to the stranded crew. Despite this temporary relief, Columbus and his men were still stranded, with no way of reaching Hispaniola. For nearly a year, they waited for rescue, while many of his men plotted against him. In the summer of 1504, Spanish authorities in Hispaniola finally dispatched a relief mission, and in November 1504, Columbus and his surviving crew were taken back to Spain. By the time he returned, Columbus was a broken man. Queen Isabella, his strongest supporter, had died shortly before his arrival, and King Ferdinand had largely lost interest in him. His rivals at court ensured that he never regained influence or power, and his appeals to the crown for the wealth and privileges he had been promised were mostly ignored. His health continued to decline, and he spent his final years in seclusion and illness, still insisting that he had reached the fringes of Asia. Christopher Columbus returned to Spain in November 1504, a man far removed from the celebrated explorer who had once captivated the Spanish court. His final voyage had ended in disaster and humiliation, leaving him stranded for nearly a year on the shores of Jamaica, abandoned by the very empire he had helped expand. When he finally stepped onto Spanish soil again, he found that the world he had once known had moved on without him. Worn out from years at sea, Columbus was in poor health, suffering from a variety of ailments. Some historians believe he may have suffered from reactive arthritis, writer's syndrome, brought on by infections and the harsh conditions of his voyages. Others suggest he may have had gout, a condition that caused severe joint inflammation. Whatever the exact cause, Columbus was now frail, barely able to walk, and confined to a bed for much of his remaining years. Despite his physical decline, Columbus refused to accept that his life's work had come to nothing. He was still obsessed with the idea that he had found a new route to Asia and remained determined to secure the wealth and privileges he believed he was owed. The Spanish crown, however, had little interest in rewarding him further. His governance of Hispaniola had been widely condemned, his discoveries had not led to the vast riches Spain had hoped for, and other explorers, such as Amerigo Vespucci, were beginning to gain recognition for their own voyages, calling into question Columbus's original claims. Frustrated and desperate, Columbus spent much of his last years petitioning King Ferdinand to grant him the titles and share of profits that had been promised in the capitulations of Santa Fe, the original contract he had signed with the Spanish crown before his first voyage. He sent repeated letters and appeals, arguing that he had fulfilled his obligations and deserved to be compensated. The king, though willing to grant Columbus a modest pension, largely ignored his demands for full recognition. As Columbus grew weaker, he moved to the city of Valladolid, where he lived in relative obscurity. His once grand reputation had faded, and he was no longer a powerful figure at court. He was often visited only by a few loyal friends and family members, including his son Diego Columbus, who continued to fight for his father's claims in the royal court. Columbus, however, never gave up his belief that he had reached the outskirts of Asia. Even in his final days, he insisted that his voyages had been part of God's divine plan, a fulfillment of a grand mission to spread Christianity and expand Spain's empire. On May 20th, 1506, Christopher Columbus died at the age of 54. His final moments were spent in a modest house in Valladolid, far from the great riches and power he had once dreamed of. Though he had changed the course of history, he died believing he had merely found a new route to the Indies, never realizing he had encountered a completely new continent. After his death, Columbus's remains were moved several times, reflecting his complicated legacy. Initially buried in Valladolid, his body was later transferred to Seville. In 1542, his remains were supposedly sent across the Atlantic to Santo Domingo in Hispaniola, fulfilling his wish to be buried in the lands he had discovered. However, when Spain lost control of the island in the late 18th century, his bones were reportedly moved again, first to Havana, Cuba, and later back to Seville, Spain. To this day, there is controversy over whether his remains are in Spain or the Dominican Republic, as both locations claim to hold them. Though Columbus died without the recognition he desired, his voyages forever reshaped the world. He had opened the door to the European colonization of the Americas, setting off a chain of events that would lead to the rise of global empires, the exchange of cultures, and the transformation of entire civilizations. Yet, in the end, he never fully understood the true significance of what he had done. His later years were marked not by celebration, but by pain, disappointment, and an unfulfilled longing for recognition, a stark contrast to the glory with which he had once been received. Christopher Columbus's life was one of ambition, exploration, and controversy. Though he never realized the full impact of his discoveries, his voyages forever changed the course of history, opening the Americas to European colonization and shaping the modern world. But his legacy is complex, hailed as a bold explorer by some, condemned as a ruthless conqueror by others. What remains undeniable is that his journey across the Atlantic marked the beginning of a new era, one that would bring both opportunity and devastation. Whether seen as a visionary or a villain, Columbus's name will never be forgotten. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more documentaries like this. Comment who you would like to see featured in a future video. Thanks for watching.